Hi class, and welcome to this recording. I'm so sorry we didn't meet for class today. My internet was not working this morning. Now it is working. So thanks for bearing with me. I will record the second part of chapter 17 today. I'll also record, if you have Monday lab, I'll record the lab exercise and give you the lab link and an announcement. So you'll have to do that lab activity as well. And then you guys will have a next lecture exam on Wednesday, which is December 1st. So I think we ended last week, or now about 10 days ago before Thanksgiving. We went through the vitamins, and now we'll talk about minerals. Minerals are anything inorganic that are essential for normal metabolic functions, and minerals that our body needs will include calcium, chlorine, chromium, cobalt, copper, fluoride, and you can read through that list there. So lots of minerals our bodies need as well. Daily values are what we use to describe a food label to help us eat properly, and it's based on a 2,000 kilocalorie diet. It should be about 60% carbs, 30% total fats, 10% saturated fats, and only about 10% proteins, and these are used to calculate percent daily values. Our reference daily intakes are based on 1968 RDAs for certain vitamins and minerals, and daily reference values are set for total fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, total carbohydrate, dietary fiber, sodium, potassium, and protein. So here's a look at the original food label, the 1968 version, and then we have a new label which kind of highlights or makes in bold these calories a little bit bigger, and it also kind of highlights in bold what an average serving size should be for this particular item you're eating. So it tries to make it a little easier to look right away at the calories and then what a serving size should be. Metabolism, then, I've used that word a lot. Whenever we talk about metabolism, this refers to the total of all the chemical reactions that occur in the body, and it consists of catabolism, which releases energy, and what kind of takes a large molecule and breaks it down into smaller ones. So that's what catabolism is. And anabolism requires energy, and that takes small molecules together, puts them together to form a larger one. So here are the types of metabolism. Again, anabolism, another word for anabolism is synthesis. This requires energy. This takes two smaller molecules, for example, ADP and P, and joins them together to form a larger molecule. Catabolism is decomposition. This releases energy, and catabolism breaks something large down into its smaller component parts. ATP is derived from catabolic reactions and drives anabolic reactions. So ATP is the process in which our body needs energy, and ATP is produced. The energy released during catabolism can be used to synthesize ATP. And this is a look at what ATP looks like. It's called adenosine triphosphate, because it has these three phosphate groups on. And what happens is ATP is really important in our bodies. Our bodies need energy, and our bodies get energy when we break apart these phosphate groups off of ATP. And that's called anabolism. It's the energy requiring process by which smaller molecules join to form larger ones, and anabolic reactions result in the synthesis of the molecules necessary for life. And anabolism gets the energy when ATP is broken down. When these bonds between the phosphate groups are broken, that gives off energy, which our body needs to synthesize many of our molecules. So ATP is called adenosine triphosphate. It's an energy carrier, and again, energy is released when ATP is broken apart. Some ATP is produced in the cytoplasm of our cells, but most of the ATP that our body needs is produced in the mitochondria of our cells. Carbohydrate metabolism. So how do we break down carbohydrates? Monosaccharides are the breakdown products of carbohydrates. They're the simple sugars, with the most important monosaccharide or simple sugar being glucose. And any excess glucose in the blood following a meal can be used to form glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose, or it can be partially broken down and the components used to form other lipids. The metabolism of carbohydrates involves anaerobic and aerobic respiration, meaning respiration that uses oxygen, and does not use oxygen, with glycolysis being an anaerobic step, no oxygen being required, and the citric acid cycle being the aerobic step, which requires oxygen. So glycolysis is kind of our first step in glucose metabolism, where we take glucose and we turn it into ATP. So glycolysis is the first step. It's a series of reactions that occur in the cytoplasm. And really simply put, glycolysis is the breakdown of glucose to 2 pyruvic acid molecules. And when glucose is converted to pyruvic acid, we produce 2 ATP and 4 more ATP molecules, which in summary, we have a net gain of 2 ATP. So really simply put, when we're going through the steps of glycolysis to turn glucose into energy, we start off by using 2 ATP, we produce 4 ATP. So at the end, we have a net gain of 2 ATP molecules. And again, this occurs in the cytoplasm of our cells. Anaerobic respiration, again, is breaking down glucose without oxygen. And again, this happens in glycolysis. It results in the production of 2 molecules of lactate and 2 molecules of ATP. And if this continues to go on, the lactate can turn into lactic acid, and that can build up in our muscles. And so in the absence of oxygen, if our muscles are doing a lot of weightlifting or running and they run out of oxygen to work, they'll build up this lactic acid, and that's what causes the burning that we feel in our muscles. Anaerobic respiration, again, can be divided into these 2 phases: glycolysis, where glucose undergoes reaction to produce pyruvic acid, 2 ATP, and 2 NADH molecules, which will be important later for a step called the electron transport chain. And then lactic acid formation is when pyruvic acid is converted to lactic acid and then converted to lactate. And that occurs again in the absence of oxygen. Absence of oxygen means anaerobic respiration. So here's glycolysis and anaerobic respiration. So glycolysis producing the 2 ATP, the 2 NADH, and again with lactic acid forming the 2 lactate. And again, this happens anaerobically in the absence of oxygen. Then aerobic respiration means that there is oxygen present, and whenever oxygen is present, we can always do a lot more. When we do an aerobic respiration, we're breaking down glucose in the presence of oxygen to produce carbon dioxide as a waste product and water as a waste product. And carbon dioxide is water as a waste product. In order for our body to get rid of them, we can exhale. And that process of exhaling is the way that our body gets rid of carbon dioxide and water, which is always a waste product of aerobic respiration. During aerobic respiration, so in the presence of oxygen, we can produce up to 38 ATP. And we can divide aerobic respiration into 4 phases, the first being glycolysis, which we still, even though I said it was an anaerobic process, glycolysis can start the aerobic respiration process as well, producing the same products, 2 pyruvic acids, 2 ATP, and 2 NADH. Each pyruvic acid from glycolysis will form an acetyl-CoA, and an acetyl-CoA is a molecule that will go into the citric acid cycle, which is also known as the Krebs cycle. So acetyl-CoA will enter into the Krebs cycle, and then we'll produce more NADH, FADH. And these 2 molecules, again, will be really important because they're carrying electrons within their bonds, and they will be really important for the final step of aerobic respiration called the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain, this occurs within the inner mitochondrial membrane of the mitochondria. If you remember back to the beginning, the mitochondria was kind of an interesting organelle because it had a double membraned layer. And the electron transport chain is a series of molecules that transport electrons between them, and they are attached kind of in this inner mitochondrial membrane. Electrons are transferred from these carriers, which we produced in the previous 2 steps, and that's why they're really important. So these electrons are coming from NADH and FADH, and they're coming when hydrogen is released, and hydrogen will be released and travels into the inner mitochondrial compartment. Some of these electron transport carriers are also hydrogen pumps, and they use the energy from transported electrons to pump hydrogen from the inner to outer mitochondrial compartment. And I think eventually we'll show you a little picture here. Because we have more hydrogen kind of in this outer compartment and less in the inner compartment, the hydrogen will pass through a channel that couples the movement of hydrogen to produce ATP. And without oxygen, and this is why our bodies need oxygen to survive, without oxygen, we can't accept these excess hydrogens and electrons. So remember, we're kind of pumping these hydrogens through, we're pumping electrons through these electron carriers in the membrane. And without oxygen, we can't accept those excess hydrogens and excess electrons. So the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain couldn't function, and our bodies wouldn't be able to produce ATP. So in terms of your next lecture exam, I think there's just 3 questions. You need to understand really simply what glycolysis is. That produces 2 ATP. It happens in the cytoplasm. That's the first step in aerobic respiration. And then we have the pyruvic acid molecules entering this citric acid cycle. And the citric acid cycle, so I think down here we have 2 pyruvic acid molecules are converted to acetyl-CoA, producing 2 carbon dioxide and 2 NADH. The 2 acetyl-CoA molecules then enter the citric acid cycle, which is kind of this circular kind of mechanism of many chemical reactions. And then the electron transport carriers will take their electrons to the electron transport chain, which is the final step. And the electron transport chain is what uses those electrons to produce the most ATP. And that's what occurs in this inner mitochondria. So really simply put, for your lecture exam, you just need to know kind of those 3 steps: glycolysis, citric acid cycle, electron transport chain, and just really simply what happens in each of those 3 steps. Here's a great look at the final step, the electron transport chain, showing this inner membrane and outer membrane. And these little complexes that have Roman numerals are transporting electrons between them. And when they do that, they're pumping these hydrogen ions across the membrane to produce a gradient of the more concentrated hydrogen ions here. When that occurs, we have more hydrogen in the outer compartment and less in the inner compartment. So by simple diffusion, they'll rush through this protein complex called ATP synthase. And the rushing of hydrogen down kind of turns a rotor pump that will pump out about 34 to 38 ATP. So this electron transport chain is kind of the most important step in creating ATP because it produces the most. Again, we're getting about 38 ATP from this aerobic process, and it all starts with just 1 glucose molecule. And again, oxygen is required because oxygen will combine with the excess hydrogen, the excess electrons, to produce water as a waste product from this reaction. And again, our body gets rid of water through urination, defecation, but also through exhaling. Lipid metabolism then, triglycerides are the body's main energy source storage molecules. Between meals, triglycerides are broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. Metabolism occurs in the mitochondria, and we have a series of reactions where 2 carbons are removed for fatty acids to form acetyl-CoA. And acetyl-CoA can combine to form ketones. And if we get too many ketones, this can lead to acidosis in the blood. Proteins are digested into amino acids, so they're broken down into their individual amino acid parts. Amino acids are taken up by the liver, and then they're used to make other needed proteins by the body. Amino acids can also be converted into pyruvic acid or acetyl-CoA. Metabolism of amino acids eventually gets converted to urea in the liver, and urea can also be removed from the body or used recycled to move other things. So again, these are kind of overall pathways for the metabolism of food, for what we eat and how we can turn it into energy and how our body breaks it down. The absorptive state is the period immediately after a meal when nutrients are absorbed through the wall of our intestines into either the bloodstream or the lymphatic system if it's a lipid. This usually occurs 4 hours after a meal, where glucose will go into the cells some glycogen, some fat. Fat will go into adipose tissue, and amino acids will be used in protein synthesis. The post-absorptive state will be later in the morning, later in the afternoon, or the night after a meal. This is the absorptive state where blood glucose levels will be maintained by converting molecules to glucose. The first source of glucose is in the liver. Triglycerides could be converted to glucose, and even amino acids could be converted to glucose. So here are just the events of the absorptive state. So how our nutrients are absorbed, processed, and then stored and used. And here are the events of the post-absorptive state. The metabolic rate then is the total amount of energy produced and used in the body per unit of time. And your basal metabolic rate is just the energy needed to keep the resting body functional. And this is used to determine the amount of kilocalories needed per day. And that's about 2,000 kilocalories that your body needs to consume to maintain normal bodily functions. Body temperature regulation, so average body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius, 98.6 Fahrenheit. This will always be maintained by balancing heat input with heat loss, and the amount of heat exchanged between the environment and body is determined by a difference in temperature. Temperature regulation occurs by dilation and constriction of blood vessels, sweat glands, and skeletal muscles can be used. Homeostasis will occur by a negative feedback system. I think we've talked a little bit about temperature regulating in our bodies before, and the hypothalamus is always the control center. Radiation is a gain or loss of heat as infrared energy between two objects not in physical contact, like the sun, the hot sand, or the snow. Conduction is the exchange of heat between objects that are in direct contact, like the contact at the bottom of the feet and the ground. Convection is the transfer of heat between the body and the air or water, like a cool breeze. And evaporation is converting water from a liquid to a gas, like water from the body's surface. And this just shows the differences of heat exchange, radiation from the sun and water, evaporation, convection from a cool breeze, radiation from the sand, and conduction, direct contact with the hot sand. And here is how our body regulates temperature. You can see if homeostasis is disturbed, for example, if body temperature increases, for example, we'll start to sweat to try to get rid of heat loss. We'll dilate our blood vessels, which will also increase heat loss. And if our body temperature gets too cold, we'll start to shiver, and we'll start to constrict our blood vessels to kind of keep the body heat closer to our core organs. So thanks for listening to this, and I'll post this soon, as well as the posting for the lab recording. Take care, guys.